They thought money could keep me quiet. But how would you feel if your parents worshipped your sister for years, believing every dollar you sent was hers? I didn't expose her. Not until Christmas night when my father said, "Be more like your sister. She gives." I smiled and whispered, "She gives what's mine." The room froze. Weeks later, when the truth hit their bank account, it hit harder than revenge ever could. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Snow was falling softly outside the window. When I stepped into my parents' house in Portland, Oregon, for the first time in 2 years, the air smelled like roasted turkey cinnamon and the faint sweetness of my mother's apple pie. The lights from the Christmas tree reflected across the glass, scattering golden sparks across the kitchen walls. For a moment, it almost looked perfect, until I saw them. Mom. Evelyn was standing by the counter arranging white roses in a vase. She looked elegant as always, her sweater spotless, her hair carefully curled. Dad. Robert was pouring red wine into 3 crystal glasses, humming along to a Christmas song playing softly from the old speaker. Sophie. My younger sister was leaning over the dining table, sprinkling powdered sugar over a chocolate cake. Her laughter filled the room like she owned the sound of joy itself. I held a small wrapped box in my hands, a simple gift tied with a single red ribbon. "Merry Christmas," I said quietly, placing it on the table. Mom glanced up, smiled politely. "Madison, you always bring something simple, don't you?" Still the practical one. Her tone was light, but it landed like a pin drop. I forced a small smile. "It's just something I thought you might like." She didn't ask what it was. No one did. The table gleamed with silverware candlelight flickering against the dishes. Sophie set down the last plate and sat beside Mom, glowing under the attention. I took my seat across from them, the empty chair between me and my father, feeling like a reminder of distance. As we settled, Dad raised his glass. "You know," he said, voice loud and proud, "this has been a good year for us. Your mother and I are so proud of our girls, especially Sophie. She's been sending us $6,000 every month to help out with bills and the house. That's what family means, taking care of each other." The words dropped like ice water down my spine. I stared at my plate at the reflection of candlelight trembling on the silver fork. Sophie smiled awkwardly, eyes darting toward me for a fraction of a second before she looked away. My voice came out soft but steady. "Actually, that was me." The laughter stopped. The sound of the fireplace crackling filled the silence that followed. Dad blinked, his expression tightening. "What are you talking about?" I looked at him. "I've been sending the money every month." "Not Sophie." Sophie's shoulders stiffened. Mom set her glass down carefully. "Madison," she said, her voice calm but cold. "Let's not ruin Christmas dinner with nonsense." "It's not nonsense," I said quietly. "It's the truth." The room felt smaller, warmer, suffocating. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. Dad let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're mistaken. Sophie told us herself." I looked at my sister. She kept her eyes on her plate. "Did she?" "Enough," Mom snapped, her tone cutting through the air like a knife. "We're not going to argue about money at this table. Your sister has worked very hard this year, and she's been so generous. You should be happy for her instead of whatever this is." I swallowed hard. "I am happy for her, Mom. I just thought you should know." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. The only sound was the faint hum of the Christmas lights above us flickering in and out of rhythm. Sophie finally lifted her head, eyes glistening. "Madison," she murmured. "Please not tonight." I looked at her, my little sister with the perfect hair, the perfect voice, the perfect excuses. And something inside me let go. "Don't worry," I said softly. "It won't happen again." Mom frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing." I forced a small smile. "Let's just eat. It's Christmas." Dad cleared his throat, trying to restart the evening. "Right," he said, raising his glass again, though the warmth in his voice was gone. "To family." No one echoed him. I looked around the table at my mother, pretending not to see me, at my father lost in his pride, and at Sophie avoiding my eyes as if my presence had become inconvenient. The candles flickered their light, shifting across their faces, and I suddenly felt like I didn't belong in that photograph-perfect room at all. The turkey grew cold on my plate, Conversation picked up again slowly this time about Sophie's latest project and her new partnership in Los Angeles. I sat quietly nodding when appropriate, smiling when required. It was the same routine I'd mastered years ago. Stay polite, stay invisible. When dinner ended, I helped clear the table, stacking plates in silence, while Mom and Sophie talked in the living room. Their laughter floated back to me soft and familiar. I looked toward the window. Snow was falling harder now, the wind brushing white flakes against the glass. I stood there a long time listening to the muffled sound of family behind me, the music, the clinking of glasses, the world that didn't have a place for me. Then I reached for my coat, Madison. Dad called from the couch, his voice distant. "Don't forget to take some leftovers." "I'm fine," I said, slipping on my gloves. Outside, the cold hit me immediately. The sky was pale and heavy, and the Christmas lights strung across the porch shimmered against the snow. I took a breath, the air sharp in my lungs. Behind me, laughter echoed faintly through the door I had just closed. For a long moment I stood there watching the light spill from the windows, warm and golden, touching everything except me. Then I stepped into the falling snow, letting it melt against my face. That was the night I realized nothing about this family would ever change. And for the first time, I didn't feel like proving them wrong. I just felt done. I was 10 the first time I realized that being good wasn't enough to be seen. It was a rainy Saturday in Portland, the kind where the clouds sat low and gray over the rooftops, and the house smelled like laundry detergent and the tomato soup my mom always made when we stayed in. I came running into the living room, clutching a small gold trophy from my school's science fair, still warm from the teacher's hand. "Dad. Mom. I won first place," I said, breathless, holding it out like it was proof I mattered. Dad was sitting in his recliner, glasses low on his nose, reading the newspaper. He looked up for half a second and smiled, the polite, distracted kind of smile adults give when they're thinking about something else. "Good job, sweetheart," he said. "That's what we expect from you. You've always been our responsible one." Then he turned to my sister, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her crayons spread out. "What about you, Soph? What did you make today?" Sophie held up a piece of paper covered in pink and yellow scribbles. "A unicorn," she declared proudly. Mom gasped like she'd just seen a miracle. "Oh, that's beautiful, baby. Look how creative you are." She pinned the picture to the refrigerator right next to last week's drawing, a crooked rainbow with our family under it. I remember standing there, still holding my trophy, watching them. The gold paint shimmered under the kitchen light, but no one was looking. My mother walked past me, kissed Sophie's head, and said, "See, Madison, you should draw more. You're always in your books. Let your imagination breathe." I didn't answer. I just carried the trophy to my room and placed it on my desk between my notebooks. The house was filled with laughter from the kitchen. Mine stayed quiet. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first time I understood that love in my house wasn't unconditional. It was earned. And some of us had better chances at earning it than others. Years later, that memory would come back to me every time I achieved something big. Every degree, every job offer, every milestone. I could still hear my dad saying, "That's what we expect from you." By the time I turned 13, the pattern was already carved deep. My birthday fell a week before Christmas, which meant most of my gifts came wrapped in holiday paper, and the same explanation. "We'll celebrate together." That year, Mom gave me a stack of hardback books. Textbooks, really. "You said you wanted to be a scientist," she said, smiling. "This will help you get ahead." Sophie squealed beside me as she unwrapped a brand new bicycle, bright blue, with a silver bell that sparkled under the living room lights. I stared at it for a moment, not sure what to say. Mom noticed. "Don't look like that, sweetheart," she said gently. "You already have everything you need. You're so mature." "But Sophie, she needs to be outside more. She's not as focused as you." Dad nodded in agreement, sipping his coffee. "You're our serious one, Maddie. You'll thank us when you're older." I did thank them. I always did. It was easier than explaining that every responsible one deserves to be hugged too. That night, after the candles were blown out and the dishes were washed, I sat on my bed and listened to their voices floating in from the living room. They were laughing. Mom, Dad, Sophie, about something I didn't hear. The laughter rose and fell like a song I was never invited to sing. I looked at the stack of books on my nightstand, the covers stiff and untouched, and for a moment I wanted to throw them all away. Instead, I picked one up and opened to the first page. The words swam in front of me, meaningless, heavy. Through the thin wall, I could hear Sophie ringing the bell on her new bike, even though she was inside. Mom's voice followed soft and proud. That's my girl. That night I learned something new. Silence could hurt more than words. In school, I started working harder, as if achievements could fill the space that affection left behind. I brought home report cards, lined with straight A's science fair ribbons and essay awards. They hung on the fridge for a week, sometimes 2, before a new drawing from Sophie covered them. When I asked once why they didn't keep the awards up longer, Mom said, "Sweetheart, your success is part of who you are. We don't need reminders. But Sophie, she needs encouragement." I nodded, pretending it made sense. It didn't. By the time I was 16, I had stopped expecting them to show up for the moments that mattered. When I played piano in the spring recital, they left halfway through because Sophie wasn't feeling well. When I got invited to a regional math competition, Mom said, "That's wonderful, honey, but didn't ask when it was." I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need them there. But every time I stood on a stage or held a certificate, I still found myself scanning the crowd for faces that never appeared. There's a photo somewhere in the family albums, Christmas Eve 1999. Sophie in a red velvet dress holding her new doll, smiling up at the camera. I'm in the background, sitting on the floor with an open encyclopedia half-smile frozen mid-turn. No one looking at that picture would know which of us was the successful one. They'd only see who was loved out loud. It took me years to stop wanting to switch places with her. That winter, the snow came late. On New Year's Eve, I sat by the window of my room, watching flakes drift down in the streetlight glow. The house was quiet. Sophie had fallen asleep early. I traced a line through the condensation on the glass and whispered to no one. Next year I'll be different. But I wasn't. Not yet. When you grow up being told you're strong, what they really mean is that they think you'll survive their neglect. I did survive it. But that strength came with a cost. And every Christmas since then, when I saw snow fall against the window, I could still feel the same cold that settled inside me that night. A reminder that even in a house full of light, some children grow up in the dark. When I left Portland for college, it felt like stepping into a world that didn't know my name yet, and that was a relief. Eugene was gray and cold that fall, the streets lined with wet leaves and the smell of coffee and rain. I rented a tiny room near campus just big enough for a desk, a bed, and a second-hand lamp that flickered when I studied too late. Most nights I ate instant noodles from a paper bowl while the sound of rain tapped against the window. During the day, I worked at the university library shelving books and scanning IDs at the front desk. It was quiet work, monotonous, but I liked it. I liked being surrounded by knowledge by people chasing things that had nothing to do with family approval. Some nights I stayed after hours reading finance journals under the dim light until my vision blurred. I was determined to build something for myself that no one could take credit for. When you grow up being doubted, you start to build your own version of trust, one that doesn't depend on anyone else's voice but your own. I graduated a year early summa cum laude, the day I got my acceptance letter for a summer internship at a boutique investment firm in San Francisco. I stared at the email for a long time before smiling. There was no one to tell no one to celebrate with. My parents were proud in the way people are proud of something they don't understand. "That's good," Dad said on the phone. "Now make sure it pays well." It didn't, not yet. I spent that first summer working 10-hour days and sleeping in a small apartment shared with 2 other interns. My boss, a man named Paul, liked to joke during meetings. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he'd say, smirking. "Just make sure the coffee's hot and the reports are clean." I didn't answer him. I just stayed late every night fixing his mistakes, tightening his presentations, and eventually, when the partners asked questions, I was the one who had the answers. By the end of the internship, Paul pulled me aside. "You're sharp," he admitted. "Didn't think you'd last this long." I smiled. "That makes 2 of us." The partners offered me a full-time job when I graduated. It wasn't glamorous, long hours, numbers that blurred together. But I loved it. For the first time, my worth was measured in something I could quantify. Results, profit, precision. I moved into a small apartment in San Francisco with a view of the bay, if I leaned far enough over the window. I ate takeout most nights, learned to sleep through the sound of traffic, and started collecting tiny pieces of success. A raise, a bonus, a title. I never told my family about most of it. They never asked. One night when I was 24, I sat on my bed, scrolling through photos from Sophie's social media. She was in Los Angeles by then, smiling in designer clothes, surrounded by people I'd never met. Mom had texted me earlier that evening. "Your sister just signed a modeling contract. You should see the photos." I had texted back. That's great, and put the phone face down. Later that night, I opened my banking app and set up my first transfer to my parents, $2,500. The next month, I did it again. Then again. Each time I told myself it was practical. Dad's health insurance, Mom's flower shop bills, the mortgage. But deep down, I hoped maybe it would mean something else. Maybe when they saw the money, they'd see me. Months passed. The work got harder, the hours longer. I became an analyst at a larger firm, one with glass walls and high floors, where everyone spoke in numbers and code. My manager, a woman named Laura Mitchell, was one of the few who noticed me. "You don't talk much," she said one night as I was gathering my things. "That's dangerous in this business. People forget who you are when you're quiet." I wanted to tell her that I was used to being forgotten, but instead I just nodded. Every year after that, I sent more money home. I never missed a payment. When my salary hit 6 figures, I raised the transfer to $4,000 a month. Mom never mentioned it, not once. But she texted about Sophie all the time. "Your sister's photos are all over the mall display. She's in a new commercial for a local brand. You'd love it. You should visit her. She misses you." I doubted that last one. Sophie rarely replied to my messages unless she needed something. Still, I sent her birthday gifts money for flights. Even a deposit once when she said her rent was late. She thanked me with a heart emoji. Some nights I'd sit by the window looking down at the city lights reflecting off the bay. I'd think about how far I'd come, how everything I had was built from the ground up, no shortcuts, no help. And yet I still couldn't shake the thought that I was building for people who would never notice the foundation I'd laid. When you work in finance long enough, you start to believe that everything has a return. Every action, every risk, every sacrifice. I thought love worked that way too. One evening, after a 12-hour day, I got home to find another text from Mom. Sophie just got featured in a magazine spread. Can you believe it? She's becoming such a success. There was a photo attached. Sophie on a beach hair glowing in the sun, smiling like her life was effortless. I typed a reply, then deleted it. Instead, I opened my bank app again. I changed the recurring payment from $2,500 to $5,000. It was a strange kind of comfort watching the numbers leave my account, like feeding a machine that kept my family running even if it didn't need me to exist. I whispered to myself, "At least they'll be okay." The truth was simpler. I was trying to buy a seat at a table that had never had a chair for me. That night, I sat in the glow of my laptop screen, eyes stinging from exhaustion. The confirmation message appeared, "Transfer scheduled successfully." The blue light flickered across my face, painting me in a color that wasn't warmth, but looked enough like it to fool me. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and told myself this was what success looked like. Stability, independence, gratitude. But deep down, I knew it wasn't gratitude I wanted. It was recognition. And no matter how many zeros I added to those transfers, it still wasn't coming. The conference room smelled faintly of espresso and anxiety. I sat at the long glass table, pen in hand, watching the partners shuffle papers like they were dealing cards. The city stretched out below the panoramic windows. San Francisco's skyline glittering under a fogless sky. Chad Owens, our CFO, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "So the board's nominating you for vice president," he said, pretending to sound impressed. "I guess we're really leaning into diversity this year." Laughter rippled around the table. Short, nervous, the kind of laugh people use when they're not sure if it's safe to stay quiet. I didn't laugh. I stood, clicked to the next slide, and said evenly, "If diversity means increasing quarterly profit margins by 14%, then yes, I guess we are." The screen behind me glowed blue and white, a scatter of graphs and numbers, every one of them mine. I watched the laughter fade. Chad looked down at his notes, suddenly very busy. When I finished the presentation, the managing partner nodded. "Strong work, Madison. We'll discuss final votes next week." "Thank you," I said, taking my seat. My hands didn't shake, but my heart did. After the meeting ended, people filed out one by one, offering smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Laura Mitchell lingered by the door, her heels silent against the carpet. "You handled that well," she said quietly. "You just won a small battle, but don't let them see you tired. They love that." I nodded. "I'm used to hiding tired." She gave a knowing smile. That's what I thought. When the floor cleared, I stayed. The office was quieter at night, the kind of quiet that hums with leftover tension. Outside the city, lights flickered like heartbeat monitors, steady, constant, unbothered. I sat at my desk, the only pool of light in the entire floor, and glanced at the photo frame beside my laptop. It was from years ago. Mom, Dad, Sophie, and me at Cannon Beach. Sophie was wearing the yellow raincoat I'd outgrown. Mom's hand rested on her shoulder. Mine was in my pocket. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Mom, Sophie's going through something. Can you send a little extra this month? I read it twice, maybe 3 times. Not a hello, not a how are you, just the same request wrapped in guilt. I typed a reply. How much? Then I deleted it. Instead, I turned the phone face down. Outside the window, Market Street was a river of headlights. I watched it flow, the cars moving like they had somewhere worth being. When you grow up having to earn every ounce of belief, you learn to survive on silence. But silence doesn't mean peace. It's just the absence of noise. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of the building, the faint echo of an elevator bell somewhere down the hall. The office lights dimmed automatically after 9. It felt symbolic. The glow from my computer screen caught the edge of the family photo again. For a moment, I thought about texting Mom, not to argue, not to explain, just to ask how Sophie was doing. But then I remembered the last time I'd tried. She had said, "You wouldn't understand, honey. You've always had everything figured out." I never replied. Around 11, I finally shut down my laptop and stepped into the hallway. My heels echoed against the marble. In the reflection of the glass wall, I looked older than I felt. Someone polished, capable, unreachable. I was about to leave when a familiar voice called from behind me. Madison Clark. You're impossible to catch these days. I turned. Nathan Cooper. Lawyer, college friend, still impossibly calm in a gray suit. He worked with one of our corporate clients and had that same easy confidence he'd had in school. Long time, I said, surprised. How's life in litigation? He chuckled. Predictable. How's life in finance? Still running faster than everyone else, just to stand still, I laughed under my breath. That accurate, huh? He studied me for a moment, then said, Some people need others to believe in them to keep going. You've been proving people wrong for so long, I think you forgot how to stop. The words hit harder than I expected. You make that sound like a bad thing. It's not. He said softly, It's just lonely. I didn't have an answer for that. We said goodbye in the parking garage, the sound of his footsteps fading into the concrete echo. I stood there longer than I should have, breathing in the cold air. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I poured a glass of wine, sat by the window, and opened the email from Mom again. Sophie's going through something. I could almost hear her voice. Half worry, half pride. Sophie was always the one they had to protect. I was the one expected to handle everything. I typed a response, simple and polite. I'll send it tomorrow. Then before I could hit send, I deleted that too. My eyes drifted to the clock. 12:07. The city outside shimmered indifferent. I thought about Nathan's words, about battles won quietly and recognition that never came. I picked up the photo from my desk, the one from Cannon Beach. The glass was cold under my fingers. I studied our faces, the same 4 people frozen in a lie that looked like happiness. I placed it back down face first and whispered to no one. I'm not tired. I'm just done being their proof. The heater kicked on, filling the silence with a low hum. I leaned back, watching my reflection in the dark window. That was the night I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to stop explaining myself. And that realization, quiet, heavy, inevitable, was the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. Something that felt a little like freedom and a little like breaking. The apartment lights in Los Angeles burned too bright against the night, reflecting off every mirror, every shiny piece of glass Sophie owned. From the outside, her life looked golden. Fashion racks lined against the wall. Soft pink curtains, a marble counter covered in cosmetics, and camera lights. She was in the middle of a live stream, her voice high and cheerful. Hey, loves, she said into her phone, smiling wide, the kind of smile that took effort to hold. Today we're styling winter looks on a budget. I know you've all been asking about how I built my client list, and yes, it's been crazy lately. 6,000 a month and counting. Hearts and comments flashed up the screen. Your goals, one said. Wish I had your life, another. Sophie laughed, lightly, flipped her hair, and ended the stream. As soon as the camera light turned off, her shoulders dropped. She sat still for a moment, staring at her reflection in the black screen. The makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. Her smile disappeared entirely. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic from Sunset Boulevard below. Bills covered the coffee table, utility, credit cards, rent, overdue notices. She picked one up, crumpled it, and tossed it aside. Her phone buzzed. A message from a friend, Leah Girl. "You're killing it. Still making $6,000 a month. Teach me your ways," Sophie typed quickly. Ha ha ha. Yes, my clients are keeping me so busy. I barely sleep. She stared at the words, then at the screen showing her bank app. The balance stared back, $42.76. In another tab, the name Clark Family Fund sat above a steady history of deposits. $6,000 every month like clockwork. The name, Madison Clark, appeared next to each transfer, but Sophie had long since blurred that truth into something else. When her parents first asked about the money years ago, she hadn't planned to lie. It had started small. Mom assuming Sophie not correcting her. But then she saw their faces when they said, "We're so proud of you." It was the first time she'd seen that kind of pride directed at her. She couldn't bring herself to give it back. Now it was the only thing keeping her standing. She opened her laptop and searched for how to extend credit limit. Chase Bank. The page loaded slowly. Her hands shook as she dialed the number. "Thank you for calling Chase. How can I assist you today?" a woman's voice said on the line. Sophie cleared her throat. "Hi, yes, I need to request an increase on my limit. I have regular income deposits into my account." "Of course, ma'am. Can I confirm the name associated with those transfers?" Sophie hesitated for a heartbeat, then said, "They're from my consulting business. Clients I manage personally, I understand," the woman said. "But the records show the transfers are under another individual. We'll need verification from the sender." Sophie's pulse spiked. "That's me," she blurted. "It's just under my business name. Madison Consulting." The operator paused. "Understood. I'll note that." When she hung up, she realized her palms were damp. She stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring again with someone asking for proof. In another part of the city, my voice might have sounded calm in a meeting room, or through a call with a client. But if it had played through her head just then, it would have sounded like this kindness can become a weapon when given to the wrong hands. Sophie grabbed her wine glass from the counter, took a long sip, and opened her laptop again. She typed up a fake invoice for fashion consultation services, labeling it under a non-existent client. She uploaded it into her tax folder and exhaled as if that could make the lie real. The computer's glow painted her face pale blue. Her phone lit up with a call. "Mom." She hesitated before answering, forcing her tone bright again. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." Evelyn's voice was warm, brimming with energy. "I was just telling your father how proud we are of you, the way you've been helping us. It's incredible. You must be exhausted working so much." Sophie smiled faintly. "I'm managing, Mom. I just want you and Dad to be comfortable." "You've done more than enough, baby," her mother said softly. "We never imagined you'd be so successful at your age." Sophie swallowed. I wanted to give back." "Well, you have," Evelyn said. "Madison should take notes. She's so focused on her career she forgets family comes first." The words hit harder than Evelyn realized. Sophie forced a light laugh. "She's doing great, Mom. Don't worry about her." "You're right," Evelyn said. "Still, it's good that at least one of you remembers to call." Sophie's throat tightened. "Yeah," she whispered. "At least one of us." When the call ended, the smile slipped off her face again. The apartment felt smaller. She looked around at the designer shoes stacked by the wall, half of them bought on credit, and the ring light still glowing dimly in the corner. She opened the fridge, found nothing but a carton of milk and leftover salad, and closed it again. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, pulled open the top drawer of her nightstand, and took out another credit card still sealed in plastic. The envelope was stamped, approved. For a long moment she stared at it. She thought of her parents' proud faces, of Mom saying, "You've done more than enough." She thought of Madison, cold, distant Madison, who never bragged, never explained who made everything look effortless. Sophie tore the envelope open. The silver card gleamed under the ceiling light. She turned it in her fingers, her reflection warped and distorted on its surface. "Just until I catch up," she murmured. But deep down, she knew this wasn't catching up. It was sinking further, one small lie at a time. Outside Los Angeles sparkled careless and loud, a city built on illusions that looked beautiful from far away. Sophie leaned back on her pillows, the unopened bills spread like confetti across the floor. The glow from her phone screen painted her face again soft and blue. She opened her camera app, smiled at her reflection, and snapped a photo. Another post, another lie, another day pretending everything was fine. That night, the lights in her apartment stayed on long after she fell asleep, as if the brightness itself could keep the darkness from noticing her. The candles on the table flickered against the glass ornaments, casting soft gold reflections across the plates. My mother had outdone herself. Crystal glasses, folded napkins shaped like poinsettias. A roast that filled the whole house with the smell of rosemary and butter. Christmas carols played softly from the speaker in the corner, and for a moment everything looked like the picture of peace. But peace in our house had always been decoration, not truth. Dad poured wine into everyone's glasses, his tone bright. "You know, your sister has really stepped up this year," he said, smiling proudly at Sophie. "We don't know what we'd do without her help." Sophie smiled weakly. "I'm just glad I can do something," Mom added quickly. $6,000 a month. Madison, that's no small thing. Thanks to her, we can finally breathe a little. The words hit like ice water, though I'd expected them. I stared at the reflection of the candle flame in my glass. "That's nice," I said, my voice steady. Dad leaned back. "And look at you always so serious. You brought a small gift, but Sophie brings something that really matters." I looked up. "I'm sorry." He gestured toward the wrapped box I'd placed earlier on the table. "It's thoughtful, sweetheart, but come on. You didn't have to bring something so modest. Sophie's been helping with the house, the bills, everything." The knife in my hand paused mid-cut. "Actually, I said that money was from me." The clinking of silverware stopped. Mom blinked. "What?" "The transfers you've been getting," I said quietly. "They were from me, not Sophie." The silence thickened. Even the carol music seemed to fade. Dad frowned, setting his glass down. "Madison, that's not funny. It's not a joke." Sophie's eyes flicked up, panic flashing before she looked back at her plate. "Please, just—" she started, but her voice broke. Mom's face hardened. "Why would you say something like that? On Christmas Eve of all nights. Are you trying to humiliate your sister?" "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone," I said. "I just thought you should know where the money's really been coming from." Mom shook her head. "You've always been so competitive. I don't understand why you need to take credit for everything." Dad's tone sharpened. "Enough. We don't talk about money at the dinner table. It's disrespectful." I let out a slow breath, feeling the words burn behind my teeth. I wanted to tell them everything. The years of transfers, the long hours, the exhaustion. But as I looked at their faces, I realized it wouldn't matter. They'd already decided what was true. "If you need to believe it's from her," I said finally, "then go ahead. I'm not going to argue." "Madison," Sophie whispered, but I stood before she could finish. I folded my napkin, set it on the table, and pushed back my chair. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor, a sound louder than anything that had been said. "Where are you going?" Mom asked sharply. "I think I've lost my appetite." "Don't be dramatic," Dad said. "We're having a nice evening." I slipped my coat from the rack by the door. "You were—" I said. As I reached for the handle, I heard Mom sigh behind me. "You've always been like this. You just can't be happy for anyone else." Her voice followed me to the doorway, but I didn't turn back. The air outside was sharp and cold snowflakes swirling under the porch light. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch, the sound of laughter rising again from the dining room behind me, lighter now, as if nothing had happened. I could hear Sophie's voice, too soft and apologetic, trying to smooth things over. I paused halfway down the steps, gripping the strap of my bag. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the window, the family I'd spent my life trying to please looked whole again, without me. That's when I understood something I should have known years ago. The truth doesn't need to be spoken to exist. It just needs to be lived. The snow was falling harder now, covering the driveway, erasing the footprints I'd left earlier when I arrived. I walked toward my car, the cold biting through my coat. The engine groaned to life, headlights cutting through the flakes. In the rearview mirror, the house glowed warm and bright, a postcard of everything it pretended to be. I sat there for a long time watching the lights blur through the snow until my breath fogged the glass. When I finally pulled away, I didn't look back again. Inside that house, they would finish dinner, open gifts, maybe even toast to family. And they would tell themselves that everything was fine, that I was just being difficult again. But somewhere deep down, maybe Sophie's stomach would twist the way mine had for years. Maybe the sound of my voice would echo in her head when she looked at our parents' smiles. The tires crunched against the frozen road as I drove away. Streetlights reflected off the windshield, gold and white and fleeting. By the time I reached the main road, the house was gone from sight. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I just felt empty, like a truth finally released into the cold. And for the first time in a long while, that emptiness felt honest. The first morning of January came with a kind of quiet that felt earned. The city outside my window was still half asleep, the sky washed pale with fog. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, listening to the hum of the heater and the faint sound of traffic below my apartment in San Francisco. The holiday decorations were still up, though I hadn't turned on the lights in days. My tree stood in the corner, needles starting to fall, ornaments reflecting the weak sunlight through the blinds. The coffee on my nightstand had gone cold untouched. I walked to my desk where my laptop screen glowed faintly. The banking app was already open from the night before, the cursor blinking in the search bar, as if waiting for a decision I'd been postponing for years. There it was, Clark Family Fund. Recurring transfer $6,000 a month. I hovered my finger over the trackpad. The number looked smaller than it used to. It wasn't just the money, it was the weight behind it. 4 years of monthly transfers, $288,000. 4 Christmases, 4 birthdays. Dozens of phone calls that started with, "Can you help with this?" and ended with, "You've always been so dependable, honey." I whispered almost to myself. I've spent a small fortune buying their silence. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had built my life around logic, around numbers that added up. Yet here I was, realizing the equation had never balanced. I clicked on the transaction details. A faint tremor ran through my hand. The air felt colder, somehow heavier. I opened the photo folder next. One picture stood out. The 4 of us on Cannon Beach 10 years ago. Dad in his windbreaker, Mom holding Sophie close, both of them smiling against the ocean breeze. I was beside them, older by a few years, but blurred slightly, as if the camera had moved when I blinked. Even in a still image, I looked like I didn't belong. My throat tightened. I closed the photo. Then, without giving myself time to think, I pressed the button. Cancel recurring transfer. A soft click, and the screen refreshed. Recurring payment successfully stopped. That was it. No fanfare, no sound, no relief. Just silence. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The sun crept through the blinds and landed on my desk, turning the silver rim of my coffee mug into a faint halo. I sat there for a while, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere on the street below. For once, my apartment didn't feel empty. It felt clean. Later that morning, I walked into the office early, long before anyone else arrived. The glass walls reflected the blue light of dawn. I could see my reflection as I turned on my computer, composed, tired, but strangely peaceful. By the time the rest of the team arrived, the building had filled with noise again. Heels clicking, doors closing, coffee machines hissing. The smell of espresso mixed with the scent of fresh paper. Laura Mitchell appeared at my doorway holding her mug. "You're in early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my tone casual. She stepped in, leaning against the doorframe. "Something about you looks different today." I smiled faintly. Maybe I finally stopped trying to fix things that were never mine to fix. Her eyes softened. "Well, whatever it is, hold on to it. Peace looks good on you." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. When she left, I opened my calendar. Meetings, reports, deadlines, it all looked the same, but I didn't. Something subtle had shifted, like a thread finally pulled loose from the weight of its own tension. Around noon, Chad Owens passed by, giving me one of his usual smirks. "Big boss lady now, huh?" Don't forget us down here. I didn't even look up from my screen. I never do. He hesitated, maybe surprised by the calm in my voice, then walked away. The rest of the day passed in a blur of calls and spreadsheets. Yet, beneath the rhythm of routine, there was quiet. Not emptiness, just the absence of obligation. When the office cleared out that evening, I stayed a little longer. Outside the window, the city had come alive again. Headlights crawling across the Bay Bridge like a stream of fireflies. The view was breathtaking in a way I hadn't noticed in years. I walked to the balcony at the end of the hallway. The air was sharp with the scent of winter. Below, the lights of Market Street shimmered like liquid gold. I thought of my mother's voice, her soft command cloaked as affection. "Can you send a little extra this month? Sophie's struggling." I thought of my father's pride, loud fragile built on a lie he never bothered to question. And I thought of Sophie smiling through her fear, pretending the money was hers, convincing everyone she was the golden child. Maybe she even believed it by now. I closed my eyes, breathing in the cold. The city hummed beneath me. Alive, indifferent. For 4 years I had been buying a peace that wasn't real. Now, I could finally afford to lose it. I turned and walked back inside, shutting off the lights as I left the office. My reflection followed me in the glass, faint but steady. Sometimes, it isn't loss that hurts most. It's the moment you realize how much of your life was built around a lie you were too kind to expose. That night, when I came home, the apartment felt lighter somehow. The heater clicked on, spreading warmth through the room. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened the window, letting the January air rush in. The noise of the city drifted up. Horns, footsteps, laughter from the street below. I stood there a long time, watching it all, the glass cool in my hand. Somewhere between the hum of the traffic and the wind against the balcony rail, I felt it. Relief. Quiet, unremarkable, but real. I turned off the lamp, leaving the apartment in half-darkness, and whispered to the empty room, "No more." The lights of the city blinked back as if in agreement, and I closed the window. The call came just as I was leaving the office, the sky outside painted in late January gray. I was walking through the glass lobby, my heels clicking against the marble, when my phone started buzzing in my coat pocket. The name on the screen made me stop. Dad. It rang once, twice. I thought about letting it go to voicemail. 2 weeks had passed since Christmas, since the drive back from Seattle in silence. I hadn't heard from them once. On the 4th ring, I answered. "Hi, Dad. Madison." He said, his voice sharp, already strained. "There's something wrong with the family account. The transfer didn't go through this month." I paused, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. "There's nothing wrong," I said. I stopped the transfers. There was a silence so heavy I could hear the wind outside through the glass doors. What he demanded. I stopped sending money. I repeated calmly. Before he could answer, I heard another voice in the background. Mom on speakerphone. "Madison, sweetheart, don't do this. Don't be petty." "Okay. Your sister's had a rough time lately. She needs the help." I felt my throat tighten. "You mean the help I've already been giving her for 4 years?" "What's that supposed to mean?" Dad snapped. "Sophie's the one who's been taking care of us. Don't start rewriting history. Maybe you should ask the bank whose account those transfers came from," I said evenly. "Don't be disrespectful." He shot back, his voice rising. "Your sister's been generous and hardworking. You should be grateful she helps out, considering how much she already has to deal with. We raised you better than this." I closed my eyes. Exhaled slowly. "Then you'll find out soon enough. Find out what Mom's voice cracked through the phone, high and impatient. Who's really been helping you?" Dad's breathing grew louder, heavier. "You listen to me, Madison." But I was already done listening. "I have to go," I said softly. "Take care of yourselves." I hung up before either of them could respond. The sound of the disconnect tone lingered longer than it should have. I stood in the lobby, phone still in hand, staring out through the glass as rain began to fall in streaks down the window. People passed by laughing, clutching umbrellas, moving on with their evenings. I felt none of it. After a moment, I walked back to my office. The lights were dimmed, the city outside glowing in the reflection of the glass walls. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked at the top of a new email. "To Robert and Evelyn Clark. Subject for your records." I stared at the blank body of the email for a long time. There was so much I could have written, about the years I'd spent working late, about the guilt, about how I'd thought that money might somehow buy a place at their table. But words wouldn't mean anything anymore. They'd made it clear that truth to them was negotiable, so I kept it simple. I attached 4 years of bank statements, 48 PDFs, every transfer, every note labeled Clark Family Fund. I added screenshots of confirmation emails, the routing numbers, the timestamps. In the message box, I typed one line. "This is proof." That was all. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a moment. I thought of Mom's soft voice saying, "Don't do this." I thought of Dad's certainty, the way his anger always sounded like authority. I thought of Sophie's silence, how even her apologies sounded rehearsed. Then I pressed send. The little paper airplane icon shot across the screen, and it was done. I stared at the confirmation message email sent successfully. Outside, the rain hit the windows harder, blurring the view of the skyline. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. Calm, collected, but tired in a way that didn't show on camera or in meetings. A single tear slipped down before I could stop it landing on the keyboard. I brushed it away quickly, almost annoyed. I whispered, "That's the last time I'll explain myself." I sat back in my chair, listening to the hum of the building as the rain softened. My chest felt strange, not light, not heavy, just hollow, like something had finally settled after years of being out of place. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't revenge. It was just quiet. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be defended. It just needs to exist. I closed the laptop, stood, and turned off the office light. The faint reflection of the city shimmered on the dark screen. On the elevator ride down, I caught my reflection again, faintly warped in the metal walls. The woman staring back at me didn't look angry or broken. She looked steady. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the street. The rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, almost sweet. I walked without destination, passing glowing shop windows and steaming grates from the subway below. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played from a street corner, a lonely song that somehow fit the night. For years, I'd let money speak for me. Tonight, silence was louder. By the time I reached my apartment, the email had already been opened. My phone vibrated with the notification. I didn't check for a reply. I didn't need one. I poured a glass of water, set it beside my bed, and stood for a long time looking out at the Bay Bridge, the lights threading across the water. There was no relief, not yet, just the slow realization that I was finally living without asking permission. That night, when I turned out the light, I didn't dream of anything at all. By mid-February, Seattle was wrapped in a thin sheet of cold fog, the kind that clings to your coat and settles in your bones. I wasn't there when it happened, but I can picture it perfectly. The downtown bank with its marble floors, the muted hum of printers, the faint smell of coffee, and wet umbrellas. They had gone together, my father, my mother, and Sophie. The meeting had been arranged by their attorney, Angela Price, who had advised them to verify the source of funds for clarity. Clarity. The word itself must have sounded foreign to them. The bank manager, a man in his 50s with graying hair, welcomed them into a small glass office. His tone was polite, professional, unbothered by the tension that followed them inside. "Mr. and Mrs. Clark." "Miss Clark," he said, nodding to each of them. "I understand you're here regarding the Clark Family Fund account." Dad cleared his throat. "Yes. There seems to be a misunderstanding. The regular deposits stopped last month. We were told they were coming from our younger daughter, Sophie, but there's confusion." The manager opened his folder, his fingers tapping on the keyboard, before he turned the monitor toward them. "I have the records here. The deposits were all electronic transfers. Same source, same note each month." He scrolled through the list, each line identical, date, amount, and sender. Then he said simply, "Every transfer came from Ms. Madison Clark account, ending in 4736. The silence was immediate. Mom's hand went to her mouth, her breath catching. "That can't be right," she whispered. "Madison wouldn't. She didn't." Dad leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "No," he said, shaking his head as if sheer disbelief could rewrite the data. "She works in finance, sure, but she wouldn't send that kind of money. Not like this." The manager offered a small professional smile. "I can print the statements for your review if you'd like." Sophie's voice broke through, quiet, but trembling. "You don't have to." Her parents didn't hear her. Or maybe they pretended not to. "Print them," Dad said. His voice was steady, but his hand was gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. The printer began to whir. Sheet after sheet slid out, rows of dates, dollar signs, and my name typed neatly in black ink. When the manager handed him the stack, Dad's hand trembled. "She sent all this?" The man nodded. "Yes, sir. 4 years of consistent monthly deposits. There were a few increases in amount as well, once in early 2021. Mom's eyes glossed with tears. She never said anything. The manager hesitated, unsure if he should respond. Some people prefer privacy when supporting family. It's not uncommon. Dad stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the tile. "Excuse me," he muttered and walked out before anyone could stop him. Mom followed, clutching her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Sophie stayed behind for a moment, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking under my name. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" The manager asked gently. She shook her head. "No, thank you." Her voice barely carried across the room. When she stepped outside, she saw them through the glass doors. Dad, sitting on the bench near the curb, snow beginning to collect on his shoulders, papers still in his hand. Mom stood beside him, her hand resting on his back, both of them silent. Sophie didn't join them. She turned away, walking to the parking lot where her car was parked under a streetlight. Inside, the heater hummed weakly against the cold. She unlocked her phone, trying to breathe steadily. Her notifications glowed in the dark screen. Emails from creditors, social media likes, and at the top, a message from the bank's fraud department. "We are reviewing your recent credit documentation for verification." Her chest tightened. She scrolled through the message again, reading the phrase that repeated at the bottom. "Potential discrepancy detected in income-proof documents." Outside the car, snow continued to fall, slow and relentless. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and whispered, "I didn't want them to find out like this." Meanwhile, Dad sat motionless on the bench, the papers trembling in his hands. He read the same line over and over. Sender Madison Clark. Amount $6,000. Mom finally spoke, her voice breaking through the still air. "We didn't believe her," she said softly. "She told us, and we didn't believe her." Dad didn't look up. His jaw worked, but no words came. For the first time in my life, I think he realized that silence can be crueler than anger. From what I later heard, they stayed there for almost an hour. The snow gathered on their coats and in Mom's hair melting down her cheeks, until no one could tell the difference between snow and tears. When the wind picked up, Dad stood and looked at the papers again. The white light from the bank window spilled over the printout, highlighting my name once more. He stared at it for a long time, like maybe if he looked hard enough, he could find another explanation. But there wasn't one. He lowered the papers slowly, the sound of the city muffled under the falling snow. For the first time, my father looked small, like a man trying to hold the weight of truth that had finally stopped pretending to be something else. They went home in silence that day. No one spoke in the car. No one knew how. And while I was hundreds of miles away, unaware of the exact moment it happened, I felt it somehow. The shift in the air, the invisible thread between us, pulling tight, then snapping. They had seen the truth at last, and when they looked at it, they couldn't speak. A week later, the story had stopped being ours. It belonged to everyone else now. It started with a video, a shaky clip from Christmas dinner filmed by one of my cousins. In the footage, my father's voice was clear. "You only brought this." My reply followed seconds later, quiet but sharp enough to cut through the noise. That was me. The video spread online before I even knew it existed. Someone posted it to social media with the caption, "When your family gives credit to the wrong child." It went viral overnight. By morning, my inbox was flooded with messages. Co-workers, old friends, journalists. My name was trending under a hashtag I didn't want to read. I didn't have to. The comments said enough. "She's the forgotten daughter. Her parents should be ashamed. Imagine being this blind to your own child's kindness." Tasha Green. One of my former students from a finance seminar I'd guest lectured years ago wrote an article titled "The Christmas Lie When Kindness Goes Unseen." She had always been ambitious sharp, the kind who saw stories in everything. In this one, she saw me. The headlines spread like fire. The article was shared thousands of times across blogs, local news, and morning talk shows. Every version of the story was slightly different, but the heart of it stayed the same. A daughter's generosity mistaken for her sister's, a family's betrayal caught on video. I read it once slowly in the early hours of the morning. It was well written, factual enough, though every paragraph felt like someone pressing on a bruise I'd tried to ignore. By noon, reporters were calling my office. One even left a message asking if I would go on record about how it feels to finally be seen. I deleted it without listening to the rest. The following day, Laura appeared at my door, holding a folded newspaper. "You've seen it?" she asked. I nodded. "Everyone has." She placed the paper on my desk, tapping the headline with her finger. "It's everywhere, Madison. You're on morning news segments, podcasts, even those commentary shows where people argue about morality. Half the country thinks you're some kind of folk hero." I stared at the article. My photo, cropped from a company website, sat beside a still image from the video frozen mid-sentence. I didn't look angry in the picture, just tired. Laura sighed. "How do you feel I don't?" I said. "This isn't my story anymore." She leaned against the desk. "It is whether you like it or not. People project onto whatever they can't understand. Right now, you're everyone who's ever been overlooked. I don't need them to defend me," I said softly. "I just wish they'd stop inventing their own version." Her expression softened. "Then, don't correct them. Let the noise fade." I nodded, though I knew silence had its own price. While the world debated who was right and who was wrong, my parents were facing their own storm back in Seattle. Mom couldn't go anywhere without feeling eyes on her. At the grocery store, she overheard two women by the produce section whispering, "That's her, isn't it?" The mother from that video. One of them shook her head. "How could you take your own daughter's credit like that?" Mom froze in the aisle, her hand trembling over a bag of apples. She didn't say a word. She simply left her cart and walked out. The next morning, she went to church like she did every Sunday. Father Miller found her standing alone near the back, staring at the stained glass window. "Evelyn," he said, gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "There are some prayers that can't erase mistakes, only teach us how to live with them." Mom nodded, eyes glistening. "But what if my family never forgives me?" He smiled sadly. "Then you start by forgiving yourself. I didn't know any of this firsthand. Sophie told me later in a voicemail." I didn't answer. Her voice was shaking. "They're not doing well, Maddie. Mom hasn't slept. Dad stopped going to work. People keep talking. I think they finally realize how bad it looks." I listened to the message twice, then deleted it. At the office, Laura caught me staring out the window during a break. The fog over the bay was heavy, pressing down on the city like a weight. "You okay?" she asked. I turned back to her. "I used to be terrified of being misunderstood," I said quietly. "Now I'm afraid of what happens when people finally understand, when it's too late to fix anything." Laura said nothing. She just nodded, the kind of silence that meant she knew better than to offer comfort that wouldn't fit. The rest of that week passed in fragments. My coworkers avoided bringing it up directly, but I could feel it lingering in their glances. The knowledge that my private life had become a public confession. By Friday night, I shut my laptop, went home, and sat in the dark. My apartment felt smaller than usual. The hum of the city outside was distant, almost muffled. I picked up the same newspaper Laura had left on my desk earlier that week. The headline glared up from the coffee table, "The Christmas Lie." I traced the words with my finger. The paper felt thin, almost fragile, like something that could tear if I pressed too hard. Somewhere hundreds of miles north, my mother sat alone at her kitchen table. The Christmas decorations still hung on the mantel, though the tree had turned brittle and gray. A single string of lights blinked unevenly, casting faint shadows across the room. On the table in front of her lay the same newspaper folded open to the same page. She stared at it for a long time, the light flickering over her face. The title glowed faintly under the lamp. "The Christmas Lie." Outside, snow had started to fall again, soft and slow. She didn't cry. She just reached forward, turned off the lamp, and let the room fall into darkness. The meeting took place on a cold March afternoon in downtown Seattle, in an office lined with glass and polished oak. The kind of space where truth didn't arrive softly. It came dressed in documents and signatures. Nathan Cooper's conference room was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic outside. Snowflakes drifted past the window, melting before they reached the ledge. I sat across from my parents, my coat folded neatly over my lap. Sophie sat between them, her eyes fixed on the table. Across from me, their attorney, Angela Price, arranged her papers with practiced precision. Nathan broke the silence first. "Thank you all for coming," he said evenly. "I understand we're here to discuss the closure of the Clark Family Fund." Dad cleared his throat. "That's right," he said, his voice low, rasped from too many sleepless nights. "We've decided it's time to end it. There's no reason to keep the account open anymore." Nathan opened a folder and set a stack of papers in front of him. "Before we move forward," he said, "I think it's important everyone understands the legal terms. The fund, as it was established, lists one founder and sole contributor, Madison Clark." Angela shifted in her seat. "Our clients were under the impression that the fund was a family account, shared contributions, shared benefits." Nathan nodded politely. "Understandable. But that's not what the documents show." He turned the file toward them. "My name was printed across every page. Under the law, all assets in the fund belong to Ms. Clark alone." The words hung there still and heavy. Dad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His hand twitched against the armrest, and I could see the weight of every assumption he'd ever made settling across his shoulders. Mom reached for a tissue, her fingers trembling. We didn't know," she whispered. "We thought—" Her voice cracked. "I thought Sophie—" Nathan's tone softened. "It's an easy misunderstanding. But now that everything's been clarified, the next steps are up to Madison." All eyes turned to me. I straightened the edge of the folder in front of me before speaking. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said quietly. "I just want this to stop. The lies, the confusion, the pretending." Sophie's chin trembled. "Maddie," she said softly, using the nickname she hadn't said in years. "I never meant for it to get this far. I didn't tell them it was me. They just assumed." I looked at her steady and tired all at once. "You didn't correct them either." Her shoulders sank. "I know." Mom's tears spilled over then. "I was so proud," she said, her voice small. "I wanted to believe she'd finally found her place. And when you said it was you that night, I thought you were just being cruel." She covered her face, her sobs muffled against her palms. "I was wrong." Dad's eyes stayed fixed on the table, the reflection of the documents shimmering in the polished wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "We failed you, didn't we? I didn't answer right away." The silence stretched thick and fragile. Nathan leaned back, giving me space to respond. "I don't need an apology," I said finally. "I just need everyone to stop rewriting the truth. That's all I've wanted." Nathan nodded slightly, as if to mark the words into record. "Then I believe that concludes this discussion." He gathered the papers into a single folder and slid it across the table. "I'll draft the dissolution documents this week. Madison, you'll receive confirmation of closure by Friday." I stood smoothing my coat. Sophie followed suit, clutching her purse like it was a shield. Dad stayed seated. After a long pause, he rose and walked toward me. His movements were slow, uncertain, like each step took more effort than the last. When he stopped in front of me, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since I was a child. Fear, regret, and something even rarer, humility. "Madison," he said, his voice rough. "I'm proud of you." For a moment I couldn't speak. He swallowed hard. I should have said that a long time ago. I nodded once, the gesture small but real. "Thank you." He gave a short, uneven breath, half relief, half sorrow, and stepped back. Mom stood behind him, her face blotched with tears. "Can we start over?" she asked. I met her eyes. Starting over doesn't erase what happened. But maybe it's enough to know we don't have to keep pretending. She nodded, unable to speak. Nathan walked us to the door. "You handled this with grace," he said quietly, when the others were out of earshot. "Most people would have wanted revenge." "Revenge wastes too much energy," I replied. "I'm tired." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes silence is the fairest kind of justice." Outside, the air hit me like a breath I hadn't taken in years. Cold, clean, honest. The snow had stopped, leaving a thin layer of frost over the sidewalks. I walked slowly, feeling the crunch beneath my boots. Behind me, the office lights glowed warm against the glass, but I didn't look back. As I reached the street corner, the wind brushed against my face, carrying the scent of the sea from somewhere beyond the city. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's accepting that the past can't be rewritten, only acknowledged. The sky above Seattle was pale and clear. the sunlight melting through thin clouds. I tilted my head back and let it touch my face. For a moment, I just stood there breathing, letting the warmth seep into my skin. The air was sharp, the city alive, and my heart, quiet but steady. It felt like the end of something, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something else. A year later, Christmas returned quietly. San Francisco shimmered under soft rain. The city lights blurred like watercolor behind my window. My apartment felt different this time, not larger but fuller. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, and a small tree stood in the corner, wrapped in gold lights, simple and calm. I'd spent the afternoon cooking with a few friends, women I'd met through the program I'd started earlier that year. Bright Steps. It wasn't a big organization, at least not yet. Just a small group of women who had decided that financial freedom wasn't a dream reserved for someone else. We met twice a month in coffee shops and community centers, talking about credit savings and sometimes the kind of courage that has nothing to do with money. Tonight, a few of them had come over for dinner. My dining table, once sterile and bare, was now scattered with candles, half-empty glasses of red wine, and plates of food we'd cooked together. Someone had brought homemade pie. Someone else brought stories. "Okay," said Julia, one of the women from the group, raising her glass. To our fearless founder, who somehow convinced me that opening my own business wasn't completely insane. I laughed. "You did all the work yourself. I just handed you the spreadsheet." "Yeah, but you believed I could do it," she said, smiling. No one ever had before. The room went quiet for a second. Then I smiled back. That's what we're all here for. To believe in ourselves, especially when no one else does. There was a hum of agreement followed by soft laughter. The rain tapped against the window, steady and light, a rhythm that made everything feel at peace. After dinner, we moved to the living room, curling up on the couch, with blankets and mugs of mulled wine. The lights from the tree reflected on the window, tiny golden dots trembling in the glass. Lena, one of the younger women, turned to me. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," I said. She hesitated. "Do you still talk to your family?" The question landed gently, but it still stirred something deep in me. I looked at the tree, at the lights blinking in slow rhythm. "We're learning," I said finally. "Learning how to listen again. Without judgment, without trying to fix everything. Just listening." Lena nodded, thoughtful. "That sounds hard." "It is," I admitted. "But sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that make peace last." When they left later that night, the apartment grew quiet again. The scent of roasted vegetables and cinnamon lingered in the air. I gathered the empty glasses humming softly to the faint sound of carols from the radio. That's when I noticed the envelope on my doorstep. No address, just a small white card tucked under the mat. I picked it up and carried it to the table. On the front, in handwriting I hadn't seen in a long time, were 3 words. "For our daughter." I opened it slowly. Inside was a Christmas card. Handmade, the kind my mother used to craft when we were little. The writing inside was careful, almost trembling. "This Christmas I will listen before I speak." Below it was a short line written in different ink, smaller but familiar. "And I'll speak only when it matters." It was signed, Sophie. For a moment I just stared at the words. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, and the lights from the tree danced across the silver ink. My throat tightened. I set the card down beside a small framed photo of us from years ago. Cannon Beach, the wind in our hair, all of us squinting into the sun. For the first time in years, it didn't hurt to look at it. I poured myself a glass of wine and walked to the window. The city was alive below the lights reflecting in the puddles on the street. A thin drizzle had started again, mixing with what was left of the early snow. The reflection of the Christmas tree flickered on the glass, wrapping my silhouette in gold. I raised my glass, slightly whispering, "To those who finally learned to see each other." I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through me. I had stopped sending money, but I hadn't lost my family. What I'd lost was the illusion that love needed to be earned through proof or sacrifice. I had stopped waiting for them to understand me in order to know my worth, and that, after everything, was the real Christmas gift. The clock ticked softly behind me, and I thought about all the women in my group, about their stories of rebuilding, starting over, finding themselves again. I thought about how forgiveness isn't a single moment, it's a practice, a choice you make every day to live without needing to win. Outside, the rain fell harder now, glimmering under the streetlights. I watched it for a long time, breathing in the scent of wet earth and cold air. When I finally turned away from the window, the apartment felt warm, alive. My eyes fell again on the card beside the tree, the words shimmering faintly under the light. I will listen before I speak. I smiled. Not the kind of smile that hides pain, but the kind that comes when you realize the worst part is finally behind you. If you've ever stayed silent just to keep the peace, remember this. Sometimes that silence is the loudest, most powerful truth you can give. I blew out the candles one by one, the room dimming until only the lights from the tree remained. And for the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like home.